Hi, everyone.
Hi, Chris. Welcome. I think
That's
this is
good.
a very well curated run of speakers. So we're going from leading with the heart, or officer, to blitzscaling. I love it. It's wonderful. Welcome. You're an investor, author, and entrepreneur. I think we're going to focus today on the work you've done along with Reid Hoffman in Blitzscaling. I'd love for you to give us a small synopsis of the book and the work you've done there, and then we'll go for the questions.
Absolutely. So, blitzscaling is our attempt to explain what we call the secret of Silicon Valley. Why has Silicon Valley over and over again produced some of the world's most valuable companies, especially when it's a relatively small area? And those of you who are joining virtually from outside Silicon Valley may not know this because of the vast reputation it has, but there is something like maybe 4 to 5 million people in Metro Silicon Valley, the entire Bay Area. It's pretty crazy. And yet, many of the world's most valuable companies, including three of the top five, because Amazon and Microsoft happen to be up in Seattle, three of the top five most valuable companies in the world are based here. And so with blitzscaling, what we realized is that the key to Silicon Valley's success is in its ability to help companies scale. And it's in a culture that encourages those companies to really aggressively grow in order to win what are increasingly winner take most markets. So if we think about the most valuable companies in the world, what do they all have in common? They're all venture backed companies that, in fact, one valuable winner take most markets. So you have Microsoft, and it's won the market for desktop OS. It's one of the main winners in cloud computing. Amazon, e-commerce, cloud computing. Google, search, and many other things. Apple, the smartphone, the Macintosh, and of course, NVIDIA GPUs. And so that's the core idea behind blitzscaling. When you identify this kind of winner take most market, the goal should be to win that market, even if the cost can be high, because the value of winning that market is enormous.
So, because we were talking today, I kind of threw the word at a number of CEOs and I said, blitzscaling, isn't that what you're doing at work? And actually, I found that some people were like offended. They're like, "That's not what I do. I do hyper growth."
So that's the funny thing, right? People have this I would call it a pop culture understanding of blitzscaling because it's a 300 plus page book. Not everyone reads the book. Instead, they rely on the headlines they've seen. They think that blitzscaling means raising a lot of money and spending it on marketing. That is theoretically one way you could do it, but it's not the only way. And the real focus is on that hypergrowth, but hypergrowth for a purpose. Hypergrowth to attain sustainable competitive advantage and enduring market leadership.
Okay, so they shouldn't be so allergic.
Well, again, I always tell people that any publicity is good publicity. It's better that they heard of you than saying, "What? Huh? What's that?"
So in your book, do you explore kind of the connection between, I'm just going to break it into scaling
Sure.
and blitz just to make it less kind of more friendly or softer, to soften it, just in terms of mental resilience and mental strength of the teams. Did you guys explore some of that?
Yes, absolutely. So, one of the things that is very true of hypergrowth is that it's stressful. Obviously, people want it, and you can say it's a good problem to have when you are growing extremely rapidly. But one of the things we talk about in the book is the fact that companies are made up of human beings, and human beings can only relate to each other in certain ways. And as a company doubles or triples in size every 6 months, it breaks the way that people relate to each other. So when you are in the very early stages of your company, you are used to a very informal way of working together. Everything is very ad hoc and flexible. But as you get to hundreds of employees or thousands of employees, which might only take a year or two, all of a sudden things are going to change. You're going to have process, you're going to have rules. And that is one of the things that is often difficult for the founder to go through. Founder and early employees get used to doing things in a certain way, and then things have to change. You look at an example of a company like Uber, for example. Travis Kalanick founded Uber. It was a very stressful place to work. A lot of bad behavior occurred. And some of that was due to the fact that he wanted to preserve a certain culture that existed when it was a small company, even when it was a large company. And obviously, Travis was ousted. Dara Khosrowshahi came in. and has done a phenomenal job of leading the company because he understood you needed to transition and be a grown up when it comes to growing one of these larger companies.
Okay. Um, so I was at a dinner in Riyadh a month ago, and it was interesting because I ended up at a dinner with all HR directors of
Mm,
listed companies in Saudi, and they were all women. Everybody thinks that, all the executives in Saudi are going to be men, but actually it was all women. So everyone said whatever they wanted to say. And, we went from children to cooking to how do you transform a company? And actually, a lot of the listed companies were applying kind of the concept of blitz scaling, because a lot of the listed companies were, especially in Saudi, where there's a lot of change in consumer behavior, there's a
yeah.
change in culture. And so they're having to really transform these large, older brands. And there's a
Yes.
lot of kind of blitz scaling going on there. And, and that whole idea of like putting it on fire, like setting it on fire and just letting it burn was coming up a lot during dinner. And it was funny. It's like, oh, for a while, it's okay. It's okay if people don't know where we're going. It's okay if there is uncertainty. It actually drives more productivity. And that kind of is not, for me, that's not very comfortable, because I love growth and I love learning, but I also am super nurturing. And I'm thinking, no, you can't do one or the other. You have to do together. So how often or not have you seen that go very wrong, and how often or not have you seen that go super right?
Well, both happen all the time, and you can see it in the form of the companies that are now iconic, like the ones I described: Amazon, Microsoft, Airbnb, Google, Facebook, you name it. But also in the giant failures, right? We've had huge failures like WeWork, for example, which it ended up blowing apart. And again, I don't think it's a coincidence that there were founder issues there as well. So here's the thing: I don't think there's anything wrong with being nurturing. I don't think that blitz scaling and this sort of aggressiveness and growth means you have to get aggressive with your employees. Right? People, one of the questions I often ask people is I say, well, do you do your best work when you're scared and afraid? And usually people say no. I'm like, okay, so why do you think your employees will do their best work if you scare them? It doesn't make sense. So I do think that it is really critical to understand that aggressiveness and carrying out a growth strategy doesn't require you to be some sort of um, um, blood drinking megalomaniac, right? You can make a rational decision to grow. I also just want to point out for some of the members of the audience who haven't visited the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia recently that things have changed dramatically over there. We have a picture in our minds of what's happening over there because of the decades of history. But in the past decade, there has been just tremendous change that's occurred. Again, people have a picture of one thing in their mind, but what's actually happening there, especially in terms of the empowerment of women in comparison to what was before, is remarkable. And it's great to see, and we want to see that progress continue.
Okay, so bringing it back, this is really today's mental health day, and it's really about mental wellness. But
Yeah.
for stories is to do a kind of a committee or an initiative to contribute to the mental wellness, the corporate mental. What would your recommendation be? What would you like to see? Because you've really studied this, but from the point of view, the ROI, we were talking to the
Yeah.
chief heart officer, and she spoke about ROI. So how do you see it from an ROI point of view?
Well, I think the ROI is fairly obvious. It shows up in the productivity of the company, it shows up in the retention of the employees. And these are things that people should care about. Sadly, there are many times when they don't care about them as much as they should, but they absolutely should. And I think where this really shows up is in the nature of the culture you build at the company. So you can build all the phenomenal, let's call them infrastructure you can, especially in the HR department, build out wellness programs. You should absolutely do all those things. However, those will not help you if the culture of the company itself does not encourage the employees to support each other, to look out for each other. So I think one of the important things is to actually create a culture where it's apparent that that matters. And that's something that happens from the top down, but it's also something that happens from the people that you choose to bring into the company. If you bring people into the company who value helping others, who value supporting others and supporting others' wellness, then your company will naturally have that kind of culture. And if you don't make that a part of any of your hiring criteria and you say, we don't care, it's nice if they do that, but we don't care, then you shouldn't be surprised if the company does not end up producing the kind of culture you're looking for. One of the examples that I use, and this is an example of sort of grace under pressure, under one of the most stressful times. During the beginning of the pandemic, obviously one of the things that happened is that all the travel went away. So Airbnb faced remarkable stresses at that time. Their revenues went down to zero for a period of time, and they had to figure out what to do. And one of the things they did was to lower their costs by laying off 25% of their workforce. That's stressful. That's a really difficult situation to be in. But one of the things that they did that I thought was so fascinating, and I haven't seen other companies do it. Instead of having Friday be the last day of employment for the people being laid off, they had Monday be the last day of employment. And here's how that played out. By the way, you can hear my dog barking in the background. They're doing construction on the house. So that's why she's offended by the construction workers hanging around.
You might want us to meet her. That might pacify her a little.
Yes. Well, I wish she would come up and hop on my lap. She's very cute. So Airbnb set the last day of employment for the people who are laying off to be Monday. And this was both for those people and for the people who are remaining behind. That way, they could wrap up all the official work they were doing on Friday. And Monday could be a day that was just focused on the human relationships, saying goodbye, comforting each other, being there for each other, right? Saying, okay, this day is not about business. This day is not about wrapping things up. This day is not about documenting things. This day is about all of us, unfortunately parting, but making sure that we honor that parting and making sure that we can support each other during that time. And I was just so impressed with that.
No, very thoughtful. Yeah. They might have a chief heart officer we didn't know about.
Yeah. That's right. And again, if you are an entrepreneur out there, you should hire a chief heart officer, but if you do not have the resources to do that, you are going to be the chief heart officer.
So you talk about companies moving from family to nations, and I think one of the you're probably seeing certain type or certain category of challenges that come up every time in that journey. It'll be interesting because it's always like if you've seen it somewhere else, it's not so bad if it happens to you. So I think it'll be great if you can share some of this kind of very obvious and repetitive challenges that come up every time. We all think we're unique, but we're all human, and the world is a really small place. Yeah.
Well, I mentioned the overall issue of moving from informal to formal, right? And that is just the nature of the beast. You can manage a family in a very informal way. I often ask people, hey, as a family, do you guys hold monthly board meetings? Do you have a written constitution? People are like, what are you talking about? That's insane. What kind of family does that? Like, yeah, it's an informal form of organization. Whereas if you had a 10,000 person company, if I asked you, so, do you have a corporate handbook? Do you have all hands meetings? If you said no, well, no, we never do that. Everyone just knows what to do. I'd be like, you're crazy. How could that be possible? So the fact is the nature of the size of the organization itself is a big difference. And you are going to have to go through those transition points as you grow. Now, one of the ones I like to talk about in the book is the transition between dialogue and broadcasting. And this is an important one for the leaders who are on this call to understand. So early on, as you have a smaller organization, you can just rely on dialogue, just one-to-one conversations with all the important people in the organization, all the employees, in order to convey what you're thinking, in order to transfer that culture, to demonstrate your caring and compassion, the fact that you actually want their wellness to be something that matters. All that can be done just normally through conversations. But if you are running a 10,000 person company, you don't have time. I mean, you could theoretically slice up a schedule and see one person a day. Well, guess what? It would take you 30 years to actually go through and see all the people in the company if you saw one of them a day. So that's obviously not viable. So you need to shift from dialogue and that sort of one-to-one to something that's much more one-to-many. And that's where broadcasting comes in. If you're a leader and you're running a large organization, you need to do something like you need to write, as Brian Chesky does, an all-hands email every Sunday. You need to record videos. One of the things I've always recommended people do is maybe even create a private podcast so that people can listen to your voice as they're washing the dishes or taking their dog for a walk or what have you. And we all know that nobody listens to a podcast in their special podcasting chair with their eyes closed and headphones on. They're listening to a podcast doing something else. And that's why we love that format, because we're able to multitask and make part of our probably boring and crappy day, or even your workout, much more interesting. And imagine if that was the voice of the leader in their ears telling them, hey, here's what's going on, here's what's important, keeping people informed and building up that kind of culture.
Just a final comment, but I mean, that transition is painful for a lot of your originals, and shedding your originals or the original builders is quite a painful, difficult.
And hopefully you don't have to, but that is the thing. So the fact is that some people just feel more comfortable and enjoy it more at certain stages of a company. I feel the same way. Personally, I like being at a company with, less than 40 or 50 people. I like the fact that it's a small organization and I can get to know everyone. And it's below Dunbar's number, since we're on a mental health side. So that's great. I don't necessarily want to be a cog in a giant machine, but I recognize that about myself. So people just need to be self-aware. If they want to be somebody who works at the early stage and they help launch a great company and that company grows, if they no longer want to be a part of that company, that's okay. They can still be, to quote one of my earlier books, The Alliance, they can still be an ally. They can still be someone who cares about the company, who has a great relationship as an alum of the company. But if you want that person to stay with you, if they want to stay with the company, they have to understand that they have to adapt, because it's no longer the same company. And you can't expect, okay, I'm just going to drop in on the CEO's office every day just to chat. It's not going to be possible anymore. But you can still be valuable to the company. One of the things that we talk about in doing this is helping people frame what's going on. So one frame might be, hey, listen, I ran the engineering department when we had 3 people. And now we have 1,000 engineers, but I'm not running the engineering department. I'm like, okay, you could view that as a demotion. Or you could say, I'm now managing 100 engineers. I've gone up 33x in terms of my span of control. It's all in how people choose to look at it and what really matters. But I do think that it is better if the company can keep the early employees, the ones who have that tribal knowledge and wisdom, who have the moral authority, and who can really help guide the people who come after them.
Great, Chris, we ran out of time. I mean, there's so much goodness there, and thank you so much for bringing the heart and the scale together, which is wonderful. Here is Nadine to keep us running on time. So
thank you so much, Lina. Thank you so much, Chris. I have been listening intensely to everything you've been saying. So we will call up on Dr. Mamdouh Barakat, who has his hand raised. If I ask him to please accept the panel's request, thank you. And if we can also get, well, Dr. Mamdouh. All right, there we go. If I can ask you to bring yourself on camera and your audio, please. Just bear with me for a moment. Dr. Mahmoud,
No problem.
we would need you to please put your camera on.
Apologies, my camera is embarrassingly disabled. I will be saving. I'm worried about your mental health. If you see me, your mental health will deteriorate.
I will just picture Brad Pitt. I'm sure
that's
exactly
it. Brad Pitt is a good one. It's a good choice. So basically, congratulations, Chris, and Blitz. Basically with Blitzscaling, and coming from an investment banking background, I started all the way back from KKR days with
Drexel. My goodness! Wow, very cool.
That's a ridiculous amount of time. So my question to you is, in this blitzscaling world, I think companies may not really have much of a choice but to go for this, because this is where everybody's pushing them. If you don't do it, you will lose. I mean, it's almost like if you're tiny, you can get away with not doing it. But in the second you start to scale, you're in serious trouble. because of that. So I'm wondering if maybe the monopolistic authorities should step in. I mean, isn't that why we have monopolistic rules, anti-monopoly? And isn't that why they're going after various companies like, Google, for example? Where are the regulators?
Yes.
And that's basically my question.
Yeah, so this is one of those fascinating questions, which it comes to the question of antitrust. So there are the two different schools of antitrust, and there continue to be debates about this. There is the school that came about, and this was mainly in the latter half of the 20th century, called the Borkian School. And that was named after Judge Robert Bork, who famously was not able to be confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. But he set what was known as the consumer harm standard, saying monopoly is a monopoly if it harms the consumer. Whereas there was a previous standard set by Louis Brandeis, and this is known as the Brandeisian point of view, which says that simply being large is itself a reason for antitrust, and that we should keep companies from getting too large. This is a difficult one, right? Ultimately, it's a personal decision. I happen to believe that there are negative elements to the Brandeisian point of view that people don't realize. The main one being that you tend to discourage folks from actually creating companies if you tell them that. However, far too often proponents of the Borkian view use as an excuse to just basically say, well, there's never going to be any need for antitrust unless somebody just does something like the pharma bro does and buys a patent drug and jacks up the price by 1,000%. Right? The problem is that we need to steer a middle path. We need to understand when companies are abusing their power, as we've seen quite a number of companies abuse their power. You could argue that a certain Mr. Elon Musk is abusing his power at a privately held company more than anyone in the world right now. But we also need to say, okay, listen, if there is a business that happens to be large, but it is not abusing its power, then that is a reasonable thing. The final thing I would say is there are often opponents of antitrust. I want them to point out that throughout history, it's actually better for shareholders and the economy to break up these abusive monopolies. Standard Oil famously was broken up, and its component pieces were worth far more. AT&T was broken up. It had started to hold back innovation, and once it was broken up, there was far more innovation that occurred. Without the breakup of AT&T, we probably wouldn't have seen the internet rise up the way it did. So I think that there are good reasons for both antitrust, but also understanding that antitrust should be done for a reason.
I figure you're very passionate about this topic.
No, my pleasure. And again, it's because it's far too often there are people who are extreme, who say, no, there should be no antitrust, fire the regulators, there should be no regulators. And then people say, regulate everything. I'm like, no. Regulation needs to exist. Economics has taught us that there are negative externalities, and the only way to address those is at the societal level with regulation. So the key is, how do we make our regulation as effective as possible?
My only comment is the regulators are all captured. We have regulatory capture everywhere.
That is one of the big dangers, and that's one of the things the government needs to take on a role for, because we have to expect that the companies are going to try to capture the regulators, and the regulators have to be chosen in a way that avoids that. And sometimes that means you have to switch out the personnel and swap it around in order to make sure that the regulatory capture at least is slowed down.
Okay. Thank you. I know we're running short of time, but
My pleasure.
Chris, I just want to say thank you before you go. I'm very blessed to have you. Thank you for your contribution.
My pleasure. Thank you for doing this. This is such an important topic, and I'm glad that I was able to participate. And hopefully next time I'll be able to convince my dog to hop on my lap. So at least if there's barking, you'll be able to see the dog.
Amazing. We look forward to that.
Thank you so much.